The morning sun painted golden streaks across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell stood at attention. His red uniform was perfectly pressed, his bearskin hat positioned exactly as regulations demanded. For 12 years he had served in the King's Guard, and every single day felt like an honor. The tourists gathered behind the barriers, cameras ready, hoping to capture that famous stoic expression the guards were known for. James had mastered it long ago. At 42 years old, James was one of the most experienced guards in his unit. Young recruits looked up to him, asking for advice on how to remain still for hours, how to ignore the teasing from tourists, how to handle the physical demands of the job. He always told them the same thing. Remember why you're here. This isn't just a job, it's a duty. It's about serving something greater than yourself. But lately, something had shifted inside James. The pride he once felt seemed heavier now, weighing on his shoulders like the rifle he carried. His wife Sarah had noticed it first. She would watch him come home after a shift, his face tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Their 2 children, Emma and Daniel, had started asking why Daddy didn't smile as much anymore. James brushed off their concerns. He was fine. He was always fine. That's what guards do. They endure. The truth was more complicated. 3 months earlier, James had received news that his father was sick. Cancer. Stage 4. The doctors gave him 6 months, maybe less. His father, a former soldier himself, had been James's hero. The reason he joined the military. The reason he pushed himself to excellence every single day. Now that hero was fading away in a hospital bed, and James felt helpless. He couldn't protect him, couldn't save him, couldn't even spend as much time with him as he wanted because of his duty to the crown. Sarah had suggested he request leave, but James refused. The guard needed him. There was a big event coming up. The royal family would be making several public appearances. He couldn't let his team down. He couldn't show weakness, so he buried his pain deep inside and stood at his post, day after day pretending everything was normal. On this particular morning, the palace was busier than usual. Word had spread that Prince George, the young heir to the throne, would be attending a private family gathering inside. The crowd grew larger, hoping for a glimpse of the popular young prince. James stood near the main entrance, his position allowing him a view of both the public areas and the palace courtyard. He had seen Prince George before, of course. Official events, ceremonies, always from a distance, always in a professional capacity. The boy was 10 years old now, tall for his age, with his father's kind eyes and his great-grandmother's sense of duty. Even at such a young age, George carried himself with remarkable composure during public appearances. James respected that. It reminded him of his own son, Daniel, who was 8 and already showing signs of the same quiet strength. The morning passed slowly. Tourists came and went. Some tried to make the guards laugh or move. One teenage boy did an elaborate dance routine inches from James's face. A group of elderly women asked if they could take selfies with him. A small child cried when her balloon floated away, landing just feet from where James stood. He couldn't move to help. That wasn't his role. He was a statue, a symbol, not a person. Around noon there was movement inside the courtyard. James's trained eyes caught it immediately. A small figure emerged from a side door. Prince George, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, was walking with what appeared to be a tutor or aide. They seemed to be heading toward one of the palace gardens, probably for an outdoor lesson. The boy walked with his hands in his pockets, looking every bit like a normal kid despite the extraordinary circumstances of his life. As they passed near James's position, something unexpected happened. The aide's phone rang and she stepped aside to answer it, gesturing for George to wait. The young prince stood there just a few feet away from James, looking around with the casual curiosity of a child. His eyes eventually landed on the guard standing so perfectly still. James felt the weight of that gaze. He kept his eyes forward as trained, but he was aware of every movement the boy made. George tilted his head slightly, studying James the way children study things that fascinate them. Then, to James's surprise, the prince took a few steps closer. The tourists noticed. Cameras began clicking frantically. People whispered excitedly. This was the kind of moment they had come for. A real prince standing right next to a king's guard. It was like something from a storybook. George stood there for a long moment just looking. James could see him in his peripheral vision, this small boy in a world of enormous expectations. The aide was still on her phone, pacing slightly, engaged in what seemed like an important conversation. George glanced at her, then back at James. Then the prince did something that broke protocol in the gentlest way possible. He walked directly in front of James, positioning himself where the guard couldn't help but see him without moving his eyes. And George smiled, not the practiced formal smile he used for photographs. A real one, warm and genuine. James's heart skipped a beat. He maintained his composure, but something about that smile reached through all his defenses. There was no mockery in it, no attempt to make him break character like the tourists often tried. It was just a kind, simple gesture from one human being to another. The prince stood there for a moment longer, then did something even more unexpected. He gave James a small, respectful nod, the kind of nod that said, "I see you. I appreciate what you do." Then George turned and walked back to his waiting aide, who had just finished her call. The entire interaction lasted perhaps 30 seconds. To the watching tourists, it was a charming moment. Something to post on social media. A cute story about the young prince noticing a guard. They took their photos and videos, delighted by what they had witnessed. But for James, something profound had just happened. In that brief moment, that simple acknowledgement, he had felt seen. Not as a uniform or a symbol or a statue, but as a person. A human being doing a difficult job, carrying hidden burdens, standing strong despite the weight on his shoulders. His throat tightened. His eyes stung slightly, though no tears would fall. Not here, not now. He remained perfectly still, but inside something had cracked. A wall he had carefully built around his emotions had developed a fracture, and through that crack everything he had been holding back began to seep through. The rest of James's shift passed in a blur. He maintained his position, performed his duties flawlessly, but his mind kept returning to that moment with Prince George. The smile, the nod, such small gestures, yet they had reached something deep inside him that he hadn't realized was breaking. When his replacement arrived at the end of his shift, James performed the changing of the guard with his usual precision. He marched away, his movements sharp and disciplined, but once he was out of public view, his shoulders sagged slightly. He made his way to the guard room, where several of his fellow soldiers were preparing for their own shifts or winding down from theirs. "You all right, Mitchell?" asked Corporal Davies, a younger guard who had served under James's mentorship. "You look like you've seen a ghost." James forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just a long shift. Heard Prince George came out this morning." "Did you see him?" "Briefly," James said, his voice neutral. He didn't know how to explain what had happened. Didn't know if there was anything to explain. A child had smiled at him. That was all. Why did it feel like so much more? He changed out of his ceremonial uniform and into his regular clothes, moving through the familiar routine on autopilot. Other guards chatted around him, sharing stories from their shifts, making plans for the evening. James listened without really hearing. His mind was elsewhere. The drive home took 40 minutes through London traffic. Usually, James used this time to decompress, to transition from Sergeant Mitchell of the King's Guard to just James, husband and father. But today, the transition felt impossible. He gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his jaw clenched. What was wrong with him? He had stood guard during storms, through hours of pain from old injuries, through personal crises. He had maintained his composure when tourists mocked him, when protesters shouted at him, when difficult news reached him during his shift. Why was a simple smile from a 10-year-old boy affecting him so much? But he knew why. Deep down he knew. It was because he had been holding everything together for so long, and that one moment of genuine human kindness had reminded him that he was, in fact, human. Not just a symbol or a uniform or a duty, a person with feelings and fears and a heart that could break. When he arrived home, Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The smell of roasted chicken filled the house, usually one of his favorite meals. Emma and Daniel were in the living room, arguing over which television show to watch. Normal. Everything was so beautifully, painfully normal. "You're home," Sarah said, looking up from chopping vegetables. Her smile faded when she saw his face. "James, what's wrong?" "Nothing," he said automatically. "I'm fine." She put down her knife and wiped her hands on a towel. "You're not fine. I can see it." "What happened?" James wanted to brush her off, to maintain the strong facade he always wore. but something about the concern in her eyes, the same kind of genuine care he had seen in Prince George's smile, made the walls crumble a bit more. "I need to go see Dad," he said quietly. "Tomorrow. Can you manage if I take the day?" Sarah's expression softened. "Of course. I've been telling you to take time off. Have you requested leave?" He nodded. "I'll talk to my commanding officer in the morning. I need to see him." That night James barely slept. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while memories played through his mind like a film. His father teaching him to ride a bike. His father at his military graduation, pride shining in his eyes. His father holding newborn Emma, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. His father at Daniel's school play last year, already thinner from the illness but refusing to miss it. How much time was left? Weeks, days? And here James was, standing outside a palace pretending to be made of stone, while the person who mattered most was fading away. At 3 a.m, he finally gave up on sleep and went downstairs. He made tea and sat at the kitchen table, the house quiet around him. That's where Sarah found him an hour later. She didn't say anything, just made her own tea and sat beside him, her hand covering his. They sat in silence as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The next morning, James drove to the military hospital where his father was being cared for. The building was modern and clean, but it still carried that particular smell of illness and disinfectant that made his stomach turn. He signed in at the reception desk and made his way to the 3rd floor, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. His father's room was at the end of the corridor. James paused outside the door, gathering his courage. Then he knocked gently and entered. Robert Mitchell lay in the bed, looking smaller than James remembered. The man who had once seemed invincible, who had served in the military for 30 years, who had taught James everything about honor and duty, now looked fragile. But his eyes were still sharp, still alert. "James," Robert said, his voice weak but warm. "This is a surprise. Aren't you supposed to be on duty?" "I took the day off," James said, pulling a chair close to the bed. "Thought it was time." His father smiled. "About time, son. Your mother would have my head if she knew you were neglecting me for that palace duty." James managed a small smile. His mother had passed away 5 years earlier. His father still spoke of her in the present tense sometimes, as if she might walk through the door at any moment. They talked for a while about small things. Emma's upcoming school recital, Daniel's football matches, Sarah's promotion at work, safe topics that didn't require either of them to acknowledge the elephant in the room. But eventually Robert got tired of dancing around it. "You look troubled, son," he said directly. "And it's not just about me. What's going on?" James hesitated. Then slowly he told his father about yesterday, about standing at his post, feeling the weight of everything, about Prince George and that moment of unexpected kindness, about how it had broken something open inside him that he had been trying to keep locked away. "I don't know what's wrong with me, Dad," James said, his voice rough. "I'm trained for this. I'm supposed to be strong, but lately everything feels too heavy. I stand there in that uniform and I wonder what I'm doing. Wonder if any of it matters when you're here and I should be with you." Robert was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and took James's hand. His grip was weak, but the gesture was strong. "Son," he said gently, "there's nothing wrong with you. You're not a machine. You're a man, a good man, and good men feel things. They hurt, they struggle. That doesn't make you weak. That makes you human. But the guard requires discipline and duty, yes," Robert interrupted, "but it doesn't require you to stop being human. And that young prince who smiled at you, he reminded you of that. He saw you, really saw you, and acknowledged your humanity. That's a gift, James, not a weakness." James felt tears prickling at his eyes. "I feel like I'm failing. Failing you, failing my family, failing my duty. I can't do it all." "You're not supposed to do it all," Robert said firmly. "That's not what strength is. Strength is knowing when to stand and when to bend, when to hold on and when to let go. You've been holding on so tight to everything that you're breaking yourself apart." The tears came then, quietly sliding down James's cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. His father squeezed his hand. "Listen to me," Robert continued. "I'm proud of you, so proud. But I don't want you to break yourself trying to be something you're not. You're a wonderful guard, yes, but you're also a father, a husband, a son. Those roles matter just as much, maybe more. They sat together in silence, hands clasped, while James let the tears fall. It was the first time he had cried in years. The first time he had allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he was carrying. And somehow, with his father's hand in his, it felt less like breaking and more like releasing. James spent the entire day with his father. They looked through old photo albums that a nurse brought from the storage of his father's belongings. Pictures of James as a baby, of family holidays by the sea, of Robert in his military uniform standing proud and strong. Each photograph was a doorway to a memory, and they walked through them together, laughing and sometimes crying. Around lunchtime, Emma and Daniel arrived with Sarah. She had picked them up from school early, sensing that this time together was important. The children were initially shy around the hospital setting, but Robert welcomed them with open arms and soon had them laughing with silly jokes and stories about their father's childhood mishaps. "Did your dad ever tell you about the time he got stuck in a tree?" Robert asked, his eyes twinkling despite his weakness. "Grandpa, no," James protested, but he was smiling. "He was 7 years old," Robert continued, ignoring his son's embarrassment. "Climbed up to rescue a cat that didn't need rescuing. Got up there fine, but then realized he was terrified of heights. The fire department had to come get him down." Emma and Daniel giggled, looking at their father with new eyes. James shook his head, but there was warmth in his expression. These stories, these moments, this connection to family and history and love. When had he forgotten how important they were? As the afternoon wore on and the children played quietly with some games the hospital provided, Robert pulled James aside again. "I've been thinking about what you said this morning," his father began. "About feeling torn between duty and family. I understand that struggle, son. I lived it myself." James looked at his father with surprise. Robert had always seemed so confident, so certain of his path. "When you were 10 years old," Robert continued, "I was offered a promotion. Would have meant more responsibility, more prestige, better pay. But it also meant I would be away more. Your mother sat me down and asked me what I wanted my life to be about. Did I want to be remembered as a great soldier or as a present father? I never knew about that," James said softly. "I turned down the promotion," Robert said. "Some of my colleagues thought I was crazy, said I was throwing away my career. But I got to see you grow up, James. I was there for your football matches, your school plays, your first heartbreak. I was there, and I never regretted it. Not once." James felt his throat tighten again. "But you always taught me about duty, about honor, about serving something greater than yourself. And I meant all of that," Robert agreed. "But duty isn't just about uniforms and protocols. It's also about being there for the people who need you. Your family needs you, James. I need you, especially now. And there's no shame in acknowledging that." Sarah, who had been listening from nearby, came over and put her hand on James's shoulder. "He's right, love. The kids miss you. I miss you. Even when you're home, you're not really there. You're somewhere else, standing at attention, holding everything in." James looked at his wife, his father, his children playing together on the hospital floor. His family. The people who loved him not for his uniform or his discipline, but for who he was underneath it all. When had he started prioritizing duty over them? When had he convinced himself that being a good guard meant being an absent father and husband? That evening, after they had said goodbye to Robert and promised to visit again soon, James drove his family home in thoughtful silence. Sarah glanced at him occasionally but didn't push. She knew her husband well enough to recognize when he needed space to process. After putting the children to bed, James sat in his study, a small room where he kept his military awards and commendations. He looked at them now with different eyes. Each one represented sacrifice, yes, but also absence, time away from family, moments missed, birthday parties he had worked through, anniversaries celebrated late or not at all. He thought about Prince George's smile again. The boy was born into duty. He would spend his entire life in service to something greater than himself. He would never have a choice about it. But James did. James had chosen this path, and he could choose to adjust it. He could find balance. He could be both a dedicated soldier and a present father. The two didn't have to be mutually exclusive. The next morning, James requested a meeting with his commanding officer, Major Thompson. The major was a stern man, but fair, someone James had served under for 6 years. "Sergeant Mitchell," Thompson greeted him. "What can I do for you?" James stood at attention, but his voice was steady and clear. "Sir, I need to request an extended leave of absence. My father is terminally ill and I need to spend time with him while I still can. Thompson's expression softened slightly. I heard about your father. I'm sorry. How much time are you requesting? 6 weeks to start, sir. Possibly longer depending on his condition. The major was quiet for a moment, studying James. You're one of my best guards. Mitchell, reliable, disciplined, the unit will feel your absence. I understand, sir, and I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but this is something I need to do. Thompson nodded slowly. Family comes first, Sergeant, always. I'll approve your leave. Take care of your father. Take care of yourself. The guard will be here when you're ready to return. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Thank you, sir. As he left the major's office, he felt lighter than he had in months. The decision had been made. He would spend the next 6 weeks with his father, with his family, being present in a way he hadn't been in far too long. He called Sarah from his car to tell her the news. She cried with relief and happiness. That evening, they sat down with Emma and Daniel and explained that Daddy would be home more for a while, that they would be spending lots of time with Grandpa. Is Grandpa going to die? Emma asked with the blunt honesty of a child. James looked at his daughter, her wide eyes so innocent and trusting. He could have brushed the question aside, could have given some vague, comfortable answer. But he owed her the truth. Yes, sweetheart, he said gently. Grandpa's very sick and the doctors can't make him better. So we're going to spend as much time with him as we can, making good memories and telling him how much we love him. Emma nodded solemnly, then crawled into her father's lap. Daniel followed, and soon James was holding both of his children, Sarah's arms wrapped around all 3 of them. This, James thought, this is what matters. This is the duty that counts most. The following weeks were both heartbreaking and beautiful. James and his family spent nearly every day at the hospital. They brought games and books. They told stories and laughed together. Robert rallied for a while, as if determined to make the most of this precious time with his family. One afternoon, when they were alone, Robert brought up Prince George again. Have you thought more about that day? About what the young prince's gesture meant to you? James nodded. I have. I think he reminded me that being strong doesn't mean being unfeeling. That acknowledging someone's humanity, including your own, is important. He's just a child, but he understood something I had forgotten. The best leaders often do, Robert said. They understand that behind every uniform is a person with hopes and fears and families. That young man will make a good king someday, I think. He already has the most important quality, compassion. He changed something in me that day, James admitted. He cracked open something I had been keeping locked away. I think he saved me from breaking completely. Robert smiled. Then perhaps you should thank him someday. James considered this. Maybe I will. Someday. They sat in comfortable silence, the autumn sun streaming through the hospital window. Outside, life continued. People hurried to work. Children played in parks. The world turned. But in this room, time felt suspended. A father and son making the most of their remaining moments together, both understanding now what truly mattered. Emma ran into the room, breaking the peaceful moment. Daddy, Grandpa, come quick. Daniel found a cat in the hospital garden and he's trying to climb a tree to pet it. James and Robert looked at each other and burst out laughing. History, it seemed, had a sense of humor. 5 weeks into James's leave, Robert's condition took a turn for the worse. The doctors gathered the family and gently explained that it was now a matter of days, not weeks. James felt the news like a physical blow, even though he had known this moment was coming. Knowing and experiencing were 2 different things entirely. He stayed by his father's bedside almost constantly now. Sarah brought him changes of clothes and meals he barely touched. The children visited after school each day, their young faces trying so hard to be brave. Emma would read to her grandfather from her favorite books. Daniel would tell him about football practice and the goals he had scored, asking if Grandpa was proud. Robert always said yes, even when the pain medication made it hard for him to focus. During the long nights when Robert slept fitfully and James kept watch, memories flooded through his mind. Not just the big moments, but the small ones. His father teaching him to tie his shoes. The way Robert whistled while making breakfast on Sunday mornings. The firm but gentle way he had guided James through difficult decisions. The pride in his eyes at James's wedding. The tears of joy when Emma was born. James had thought he was preserving his father's legacy by following so rigidly in his footsteps, by being the perfect soldier, the unwavering guard. But now he understood that his father's real legacy wasn't about military service or rigid discipline. It was about love, about showing up for the people who mattered, about being human, with all the vulnerability and strength that required. On a quiet Tuesday morning, with autumn rain pattering against the windows, Robert opened his eyes and looked at James with unusual clarity. The fog of medication had lifted temporarily, granting them a final moment of connection. "James," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Come here, son." James moved closer, taking his father's hand. It felt impossibly fragile, like paper that might tear at the slightest pressure. "I need to tell you something important," Robert said. "I need you to listen carefully." "I'm listening, Dad. You've spent these weeks with me, put your career on hold, been present for your family. I've watched you transform from someone holding everything in to someone who allows himself to feel. That's made me prouder than any medal or commendation ever could." James felt tears spilling down his cheeks. "You taught me that, Dad. You and Prince George in different ways. You both reminded me what really matters." Robert smiled weakly. "That young prince has wisdom beyond his years. But now I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you won't go back to the way you were before. Promise me you'll maintain this balance you found. You can be an excellent guard and an excellent father. You can serve with discipline and still allow yourself to feel. The two aren't contradictory. They're complementary. I promise, Dad. And promise me one more thing." Robert continued, his breathing becoming more labored. "If you ever meet that young prince again, thank him for me. Thank him for his kindness, for seeing your humanity when you had forgotten it yourself. Tell him that small acts of compassion can change lives. Tell him his future subjects will be lucky to have a king who understands that." James nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Robert's eyes began to close. "I'm tired now, son. So tired, but I'm not afraid. I've lived a good life. I've loved and been loved. I've seen my son become a good man. That's enough. That's more than enough." "Dad, please," James whispered. But he knew. He could feel it. "Tell Emma and Daniel that Grandpa loves them. Tell Sarah thank you for making you so happy. And James, it's okay to let me go. I'll be with your mother soon. We'll be watching over you. All of you. Always." James held his father's hand as Robert slipped back into sleep. This time the sleep was deeper, more peaceful. The nurses came and went, checking monitors, adjusting medications. Sarah arrived with the children. They all gathered around Robert's bed, this man who had been such a foundation in their lives. As the afternoon light began to fade, Robert's breathing changed. It became slower, more shallow. James held one hand, Sarah the other. Emma and Daniel pressed close, their small hands touching their grandfather's arm. The monitors beeped steadily, then less steadily, then with longer pauses between each sound. And then, as the sun set outside and the room filled with the golden light of dusk, Robert Mitchell took his last breath. It was gentle, like falling asleep, like coming home after a long journey. The man who had taught James about honor and duty and love had completed his own mission. He was at peace. The silence that followed felt enormous. James sat frozen, still holding his father's hand, unable to process that this was real, that his father, his hero, his guide, was gone. Sarah pulled the children close, letting them cry against her. And James finally allowed himself to break completely. He sobbed with a grief so deep it felt like it would tear him apart. All the pain he had been holding in, all the fear, all the love he hadn't expressed enough poured out of him. Sarah eventually guided the children to a nearby waiting room and returned to hold James, letting him grieve without restraint. The next few days passed in a blur of arrangements and notifications. There was a military funeral to plan. Robert had requested something simple, but as a decorated veteran, he deserved full honors. James went through the motions automatically, his training taking over when his emotions became too overwhelming. The funeral was held on a crisp October morning at the military cemetery. The sky was impossibly blue, the kind of day that felt wrong for saying goodbye. But perhaps Robert would have liked it. He had always loved clear autumn days. James stood in his full dress uniform, the medals on his chest catching the sunlight. Sarah stood beside him with Emma and Daniel, both children dressed in their best clothes, trying to be brave like their father. Dozens of Robert's former colleagues attended, many of them elderly now, but standing straight with military pride. They shared stories about Robert's service, his dedication, his humor. When it was James's turn to speak, he approached the podium with legs that felt unsteady. He looked out at the gathered crowd, at his father's flag-draped coffin, at his family watching with tear-stained faces. He had prepared remarks, formal and proper, befitting a military funeral. But when he opened his mouth, different words came out. "My father taught me about duty," James began, his voice stronger than he expected. "He taught me about honor and discipline and service. I spent years trying to live up to his example, trying to be the perfect soldier, the perfect guard. I thought that meant being strong all the time, never showing weakness, never letting emotion interfere with duty." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But in these last weeks, my father taught me something more important. He taught me that true strength includes vulnerability, that being human, with all our feelings and fears and loves, doesn't make us weak, it makes us real. And he reminded me that our most important duty is to the people we love." James looked at Sarah, at his children. "A few weeks ago, something small happened that started me on this journey of understanding. A young boy showed me unexpected kindness, reminded me of my own humanity when I'd forgotten it. That moment, combined with this time with my father, changed me, changed how I see my role as a guard, as a husband, as a father, as a son." He turned back to the coffin. "Dad, you told me to thank that young prince if I ever saw him again. I will. I'll tell him that his simple act of compassion rippled outward in ways he could never imagine, that it helped heal something broken in me, that it gave me the courage to be present for you in your final weeks, and I'll never regret that. Not ever." The ceremony continued with rifle volleys and the playing of taps. The flag was folded with precise military ceremony and presented to James. He clutched it to his chest, this symbol of his father's service, his father's life. As the crowd dispersed, several of Robert's old friends approached James with stories and condolences. Each one mentioned how proud Robert had been of his son, how often he had bragged about James's service in the King's Guard. The weeks following the funeral were difficult in ways James hadn't anticipated. The house felt emptier somehow, even though Robert hadn't lived there. It was the finality of it, the knowledge that he could never pick up the phone and call his father for advice, could never visit him again, could never hear his laugh or receive his guidance. The grief came in waves, sometimes catching James off guard in the middle of ordinary moments. He would be washing dishes and suddenly remember his father teaching him to cook eggs. He would be reading to Emma at bedtime and recall his father reading him those same stories 30 years earlier. Daniel would do something that reminded James of himself as a child, and the ache of his father's absence would strike fresh and sharp. Sarah was patient through it all. She held him when the grief overwhelmed him. She gave him space when he needed to be alone. She kept the household running when he couldn't focus on daily tasks. And slowly, day by day, James began to find his footing in this new reality, where his father existed only in memory. 6 weeks after the funeral, Major Thompson called James to discuss his return to duty. They met at a quiet cafe near the palace, away from the formality of the military base. "How are you holding up, Mitchell?" Thompson asked. His usually stern expression softened with genuine concern. "Some days are harder than others, sir," James answered honestly, "but I'm managing. My family has been incredible." Thompson nodded, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "I've been doing this job for 23 years, Mitchell. I've seen good soldiers burn out because they forget they're human beings first. Your father's illness and passing, as tragic as it was, gave you something important. Time to remember what matters." "It did, sir," James agreed, "and I've been thinking a lot about my future with the Guard." The Major's eyebrows rose slightly. "Having second thoughts about returning?" James took a deep breath. "Not about returning, sir, but about how I return. I can't go back to being the person I was before, the one who stood at attention while his life fell apart around him. I need balance. I need to be present for my family while also serving with honor. That's more mature than most soldiers twice your age ever realize," Thompson said. "So what are you proposing?" "I'd like to return to active duty, but I'd like to request a modified schedule. Perhaps rotating shifts that allow me more time at home. I know it's unconventional, sir, and if it's not possible, I understand. But I made a promise to my father, and I intend to keep it." Thompson was quiet for a long moment, studying James with an unreadable expression. Then he smiled slightly. "You know what, Mitchell? The Guard needs good soldiers. But more than that, it needs soldiers who understand what they're protecting. Family, love, connection. Those things make you a better guard, not a worse one. I'll see what I can arrange. James felt relief wash over him. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it more than you know. There's something else, Thompson said. Before you return, I need to ask you something directly. That day before your leave, when Prince George approached your post, something happened. I saw it in your face during the shift change. What was it? James hesitated, then decided honesty was the only path forward. He smiled at me, sir. The prince. Not to mock or test me, but just as one human being to another. He acknowledged me, saw me as a person, not just a uniform, and it broke something open inside me that needed to break. It made me realize I had been turning myself into a statue instead of being a human being doing an important job. Thompson listened carefully. And how did that make you feel about your service? At first it confused me, made me question everything, but now I understand it made me better, more grounded, more aware of why we do what we do. We protect people, sir, real people with real lives and real feelings. How can we do that effectively if we forget we're people too? The major nodded slowly. You've grown, Mitchell. Loss does that sometimes if we let it. I think you're going to be an even better guard than you were before, a more complete one. I'll approve your return with modified scheduling. We'll work out the details this week. James returned home feeling lighter than he had in months. He told Sarah about the meeting, about the major's understanding and support. That evening, they sat together after the children were asleep, talking about the future in a way they hadn't in years. I was scared, Sarah admitted. When you went on leave, I was scared you'd come back and throw yourself even harder into the guard, using it to hide from your grief. But you didn't. You let yourself feel everything and you came out the other side more present, more here with us. I almost did hide, James confessed. It would have been easier in some ways. But Dad wouldn't let me, and neither would the memory of Prince George's kindness. Together they reminded me that strength and vulnerability aren't opposites. They're partners. A week later, James returned to active duty. His first shift back felt different from any that had come before. He stood at his post with the same discipline and precision. But now there was something else too. An awareness, a presence. He was still the soldier, still the guard, but he was also James, husband, father, son, even in his father's absence. All of these identities could exist together. Tourists came and went, taking their pictures. Some tried to make him laugh. Others showed respect. James maintained his composure, but now it came from a place of choice rather than rigid suppression. He was choosing to stand still, choosing to embody this role, while remaining fully aware of his humanity underneath the uniform. During a quiet afternoon shift, James found himself thinking about Prince George again. The boy would be 11 now, still just a child but carrying the weight of future kingship on his young shoulders. James hoped someone was reminding him to be human too, to not let the role consume the person underneath. He thought about his father's request, to thank the prince if their paths ever crossed again. It seemed unlikely. James was just one guard among many, and Prince George was being educated, prepared for his future responsibilities. Their worlds had intersected for just 30 seconds that autumn morning. What were the chances it would happen again? But fate, it seemed, had other plans. 2 weeks after James's return to duty, Major Thompson called him to his office. Mitchell, I have an unusual request. The palace staff is organizing a small ceremony to honor several guards who have shown exceptional service and dedication. Your name was submitted, partly because of your years of exemplary service and partly because of how you've balanced duty with personal crisis recently. Apparently someone noticed. James was stunned. I don't understand, sir. I took extended leave. I wasn't even here. And that's precisely why you're being honored, Thompson explained. The palace staff, and apparently some members of the royal family, believe that your willingness to prioritize your father while maintaining your commitment to eventually return demonstrates the kind of character the guard values. It's not about being a statue, Mitchell. It's about being a dedicated human being. The ceremony was scheduled for the following week. It would be small, intimate, held in one of the palace's private gardens. James would receive a commendation, as would several other guards. The event would not be public, just a private acknowledgement from the royal household. When the day arrived, James dressed in his full ceremonial uniform with extra care. Sarah helped him with the final adjustments, her fingers lingering on his medals. Your father would be so proud, she whispered. I hope so, James replied. "I'm doing this for him. And for me. For all of us." The garden ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity. Autumn flowers bloomed in carefully tended beds. A string quartet played soft classical music. Several palace officials were present, along with Major Thompson and a few high-ranking military officers. And standing near the front, dressed formally but with the slightly awkward bearing of a boy not quite comfortable in formal clothes, was Prince George. James felt his heart skip when he saw the young prince. George had grown taller in the months since their brief encounter. His face had lost some of its childhood roundness, beginning the transition toward the young man he would become. But his eyes still held that same awareness, that same capacity for compassion that had reached through James's defenses all those months ago. The ceremony proceeded with formal speeches about duty and dedication. Each honored guard stepped forward to receive their commendation and shake hands with the presiding official. When James's turn came, he marched forward with precise military bearing. But as he approached, he realized it wasn't a palace official waiting to present his commendation. It was Prince George. The young prince stood straight, holding the formal certificate and medal with careful attention. His eyes met James's, and for just a moment recognition flickered across his face. He remembered. Somehow, impossibly, he remembered that morning, that small moment of connection. Sergeant James Mitchell, an official, read from a prepared statement. "For exceptional service to the Crown, for dedication to duty, and for exemplifying the balance between professional commitment and personal responsibility, your service honors the traditions of the King's Guard while reminding us that our greatest strength lies in our humanity." George stepped forward and extended his hand. James shook it, feeling the boy's grip, still not quite firm enough but trying. And then George did something unexpected. He leaned in slightly and spoke, his voice quiet enough that only James could hear. "I remember you," the prince said. "From the courtyard. I'm sorry about your father. I heard he passed away. I'm glad you were able to be with him." James felt tears prickling at his eyes but blinked them back. "Thank you, Your Highness. And thank you for that day. You couldn't have known it, but your kindness changed my life." George smiled, that same genuine smile from months ago. "My tutor told me that small acts of kindness can have big effects. I didn't really understand what she meant until now. I'm honored to present this to you, Sergeant Mitchell." The prince handed James the commendation, and they shook hands once more, this time with a deeper understanding passing between them. Then James stepped back and saluted, the gesture crisp and perfect. George returned the salute with surprising precision for someone so young, and James could see the future king in that moment. Not just a child, but a person who understood the weight of responsibility and the importance of compassion in equal measure. After the ceremony concluded, there was a brief reception with tea and light refreshments. James stood with his fellow honored guards, accepting congratulations from various officials. But his mind kept returning to that conversation with Prince George, to the impossibility and perfection of that moment. Major Thompson approached with a cup of tea. "That was quite something, Mitchell. The young prince specifically requested to present your commendation. Apparently, he remembered your encounter from months ago and asked his staff about you when your name came up for this honor." James shook his head in wonder. He's just a child, but he has remarkable awareness. "The best leaders often start showing their qualities early," Thompson observed. "That boy is going to make a fine king someday. He understands something many adults never grasp, that power is best wielded with compassion. That acknowledgement and kindness cost nothing but mean everything." As the reception was winding down, an aide approached James. "Sergeant Mitchell? His Royal Highness has requested a brief private word with you, if you're willing." James followed the aide to a quiet corner of the garden where Prince George stood alone, having shed some of the formality of the ceremony. He looked more like a regular 11-year-old now, though his posture still carried that ingrained awareness of his position. "I hope you don't mind," George said once they were alone. "I wanted to speak with you properly without everyone watching." "Of course, Your Highness. I'm honored." George looked down at his hands, then back up at James. "That day in the courtyard when I saw you standing there, my tutor had just been telling me about empathy, about how important it is to see people, really see them, not just their roles or uniforms. She said that everyone has a story. Everyone carries burdens we can't see. And when I looked at you that day, I don't know why, but I could see that you were carrying something heavy. James was struck by the boy's perception. You could see that? Not exactly see it, George clarified. More like, felt it. My grandmother, the late Queen, she used to tell me that being royal means you have to learn to read people, to sense what they're not saying. She said it was one of the most important skills I would ever develop. I think I was starting to learn that day. Your grandmother was very wise, James said gently. And so are you, Your Highness. That day, I was struggling with my father's illness. I had been holding everything in for so long, trying to be strong, trying to be perfect, and your simple acknowledgement, your smile and nod, it cracked something open in me. It reminded me that I was human, that being strong didn't mean being unfeeling. George listened intently. Did it help? With your father? It did, James confirmed. Because of that moment and some other things that followed, I took leave to be with him. I got to spend his last weeks really present, really there. I got to tell him I loved him. I got to hear his stories and hold his hand and be his son, not just a soldier. And when he passed, I had no regrets about the time we'd had. That's a gift, Your Highness. A gift your kindness helped give me. The young prince's eyes were bright with emotion. I'm glad. My father tells me that our actions ripple outward in ways we can't always see, that we should try to make those ripples positive ones. I didn't know that moment mattered so much to you, but I'm happy it helped. Your father is right, James said. And may I tell you something? My father, before he died, he asked me to thank you if I ever saw you again. He wanted you to know that your compassion changed not just my life, but my family's life. Because I learned to balance duty with presence, my children have a more engaged father. My wife has a more present husband. And I'm a better guard because I remember why I'm standing at that post, what I'm protecting. George seemed to stand a little straighter at this. I want to be a good king someday. Not just a figurehead, but someone who actually makes a difference in people's lives. Stories like yours help me understand what that means. You're already becoming that person, Your Highness, James assured him. You're learning the most important lessons early. Compassion, awareness, the courage to acknowledge others' humanity. Those qualities will serve you and your future subjects well. They talked for a few more minutes, this unlikely pair bound by a moment of kindness and its far-reaching effects. George asked about James's children, about his return to duty, about how he maintained balance now. James answered honestly, struck by the genuine interest in the boy's questions. Finally, an aide appeared to remind the prince that he had other commitments. George thanked James for the conversation, and they parted with mutual respect and understanding. As James watched the young prince walk away, he felt something shift in his perception of duty and service. He had spent years protecting symbols, protecting tradition, protecting an idea. Now he understood he was protecting people, real people like George, who carried enormous responsibilities with grace and tried their best to wield their influence with kindness. That evening, James came home to find Sarah and the children waiting eagerly to hear about the ceremony. He showed them his commendation, and Emma insisted on hanging it in a place of honor in the living room, right next to the flag from Robert's funeral. Tell us everything, Daddy, Daniel begged. Did you see the prince again? Did he remember you? James settled onto the couch with both children tucked against him, Sarah sitting close by, and he told them the whole story. About the ceremony, about Prince George presenting the award, about their private conversation. Emma and Daniel listened with wide eyes, amazed that their father had spoken privately with a future king. What did it feel like? Emma asked. Talking to a prince? James considered the question carefully. It felt like talking to a kind, thoughtful young person who happens to have an extraordinary future ahead of him. He was just real, present, genuinely interested. That's what made it special. Not his title, but his character. That night, after the children were asleep, James sat in his study looking at the commendation and thinking about the strange, beautiful journey that had brought him to this point, a moment of kindness from a child, his father's illness and death, the rediscovery of his own humanity, the understanding that strength and vulnerability could coexist. And now, this unexpected closure, this chance to thank the person whose small gesture had started everything. He thought about writing it all down, preserving the story for Emma and Daniel to understand someday, but perhaps it was better kept as family lore, as stories told around the dinner table, as lessons passed down through conversation rather than documentation. In the weeks that followed, James settled into his new routine. Modified shifts gave him more time at home. He coached Daniel's football team. He attended Emma's school events. He and Sarah went on regular dates, reconnecting as partners rather than ships passing in the night. And when he stood at his post at Buckingham Palace, he did so with full presence, understanding exactly why he was there and what he was protecting. His fellow guards noticed the change in him. Some of the younger ones started coming to him not just for technical advice, but for counsel on balancing service with personal life. James found himself becoming a mentor in ways that went beyond military procedure. He shared the lessons his father had taught him, the wisdom Prince George had unknowingly imparted, the understanding he had gained through loss and growth. One afternoon, about 6 months after the ceremony, James was at his post when a familiar figure appeared in the courtyard. Prince George, now 12 and noticeably taller, was walking with several security officers and what appeared to be teachers. He was engaged in animated conversation about something, gesturing as he spoke, looking every bit like a normal adolescent except for the circumstances of his life. As the group passed near James's position, George glanced over and caught his eye. The prince didn't break stride or interrupt his conversation, but he gave James a small nod. Just a brief acknowledgement, a recognition of their shared understanding. James, maintaining his post, felt warmth spread through his chest. That simple gesture, so similar to the one George had given him more than a year ago, still carried power, still meant something. Later that evening, as James drove home through London traffic, he thought about the circular nature of their encounters. A smile and a nod had changed his life. Now a nod was a reminder of how far he had come, of the changes he had made, of the promises he had kept to his father and to himself. When he arrived home, Emma and Daniel rushed to meet him at the door, full of stories about their day. Sarah was in the kitchen, cooking dinner and humming to herself. The house smelled of garlic and herbs and home. This, James thought as he hugged his children and kissed his wife, was what it was all about. This was what he protected when he stood at his post. Not abstract ideas of monarchy or tradition, but the possibility of moments like this, of families gathering at the end of the day, of love expressed in ordinary ways. That night, after dinner was finished and the dishes were done, James found himself in his study again. He looked at his father's photo on the desk, at the commendation on the wall, at the flag folded with military precision on the shelf. Then he looked at the new additions. Drawings from Emma and Daniel, a photo from a recent family holiday, a note from Sarah expressing her love. The room, like his life, now held a balance. Military service and family devotion, discipline and emotion, strength and vulnerability. He had learned, through loss and unexpected kindness, that he didn't have to choose between these things. He could be all of them, could honor all aspects of himself. He thought about Prince George growing up in the public eye, preparing for a role that would define his entire life. He hoped the boy would remember their conversations, would hold on to that understanding of compassion and humanity as he navigated the challenges ahead. He hoped that someday when George wore the crown, he would be the kind of king who saw his subjects not as masses but as individuals, each with their own stories, their own struggles, their own need to be acknowledged and valued. And he hoped that somewhere, somehow, his father was watching all of this unfold, watching his son find balance, watching his grandchildren thrive, watching the ripples of that one moment of kindness continue to spread outward in ways neither Prince George nor James Mitchell could have predicted that autumn morning in the palace courtyard. James stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where ordinary people lived ordinary lives filled with extraordinary love and connection. He thought about the guard he had been a year ago, standing rigid and closed off, holding everything in. And he thought about the guard he was now, still disciplined and dedicated but also present and whole. The journey from one to the other had been painful. It had required loss and grief and the courage to let walls crumble. But it had been worth it. Every difficult moment, every tear, every honest conversation had led him here, to this place of balance and understanding. Tomorrow he would return to his post at Buckingham Palace. He would stand at attention, maintaining the traditions of the King's Guard with pride and precision. But he would do so as a complete person. As James Mitchell, who was a soldier and a father, a guard and a husband, a man who had learned that true strength includes the ability to feel, to connect, to be vulnerably, beautifully human. And if he was very lucky, Perhaps Prince George would pass by again someday. Perhaps they would exchange another small moment of recognition, another acknowledgement of the unusual bond they shared. A bond formed by a subtle act of kindness, strengthened by mutual understanding, and sustained by the shared knowledge that sometimes the smallest gestures create the most profound changes. As James turned from the window and headed downstairs to join his family, he carried with him the lessons of the past year. The wisdom of his father, the compassion of a young prince, and the hard-won understanding that the best way to honor his duty was to remain fully human while performing it. The story had come full circle, but it wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new chapter, one where James Mitchell stood watch not as a statue but as a man, protecting with discipline what he loved with his whole heart.